Hello and welcome to Week 7's Gameplay Podcast. We have on this episode some detailed advice for one particular guest who's joining us for this episode in a slightly different format, which was mentioned on last week's podcast episodes, where we're going to be analysing some gameplay, hoping that that's going to help listeners to improve their game too. To do that, I have with me the familiar voice of JoshXLS. Hello, welcome back.
Yeah, good to be back. Been an interesting week of gameplay. I think this weekend was a little bit harder than it has been in previous weeks for quite a few people. I don't know if that was to do with Black Ops coming out and the more casual player base kind of switching off for a week or so. But yeah, it definitely seemed a little bit harder. But the meta seems to have shifted a little bit, especially tactically. So be interesting to see how people have fared this week.
Yeah, and we have a good person to do that with on this podcast. It is well-known gameplay expert NealGuides. Thank you very much for joining us.
Hello, Ben. Thank you very much for having me on as usual.
Good to have you. And on this podcast, we have someone who is, I'm sure, bracing himself for some tough critiques during this show. Actually, I mean, we're of course going to be very nice about it, but we will be looking at his gameplay and giving some advice. We have with us DJ. Hello.
Hi, Ben. I'm starting to regret my decisions in life now and feel this is going to be like that Game of Thrones episode as I am walked through the streets of 𝘵𝗱𝗯𝗀 while people shout shame, shame, shame as they analyse my gameplay.
There were some positives in there too. I'm sure we can pick those out as well to balance it a bit. We'll start off though with talking about something a little bit different because it occurred to me we haven't spoken so far in any depth at all, really, about the D-pad options you have. So if you use the directional buttons on your controller, you do get various different tactical options. Now, this has caused me some pain in some games where I've gone to hit team press and have changed my tactic instead of team pressing, which is very frustrating, or tried to, play an offside trap and also change my tactics. I'm not sure why they couldn't have kept the buttons a little bit more consistent, but they didn't. And so we are where we are and we need to talk about them. So I guess I'll ask you first of all, Josh, which are the options that you use kind of most frequently, I guess, or feel are quite useful? And then I'll get Neal to add a bit more detail potentially.
Yeah, quick tactics, as in offside trap, team press, get in the box, are the ones that I tend to use more often than not. Get in the box is something I would usually use as like a part of a tactic rather than necessarily like something I decide I need 10 minutes into a game or 20 minutes into a game. Obviously, offside trap is situational and team press depends how quickly you want to win the ball back. But I've done the same thing as you where, like, instead of hitting up, I've accidentally hit down and changed to a tactically suggested formation of like 5-3-2 or something, and then panicked. And then I send the next like 3 in-game minutes going, oh, hang on a minute, how do I get back to my initial tactic as you desperately slam all of the buttons on the D-pad? And, actually you need to go into a completely different menu on the D-pad to go to your original tactic to get out of a tactically suggested tactic. So yeah, it's definitely an area of the game that I don't think a lot of people have overly utilized yet.
Yeah, and I think it's important to talk about it. A big thing that I think we should point out just on the sort of dangers of using these is when you press down and you press either up, left or right, because that will change your formation to one of those presets, and that means your players are likely to be out of position. They're not going to be playing their roles. They're not going to have familiarity. It's going to really mess things up. But in terms of the ones that are useful, Neal, what would you suggest people do take a look at?
Okay, so in regards to just the general tactics, any of the suggestions that EA give you, I would recommend not using them. Just go with what you're familiar with. I would recommend whenever you're trying to do a setup for your tactics, if you're not sure, let's say you're just playing one formation, then if you're playing a 4-4-2, then maybe have a 4-4-2, a defensive variation, an attacking variation, and then like a balanced one. So that way, if you want to become more defensive in the game, you can just shift to a more defensive tactic. So for example, maybe your left mid and right mid, they're on wide midfielders, defend, or whatever it is for the left mids and right mids, the most defensive option. But in terms of the actual D-pad tactics, the only two that I realistically use most of the time are offside trap and team press. Those are two that I use. To be honest, get in the box sometimes, occasionally. Me, I'm not really much of a crosser, so I don't really like it. And to be honest, the overload set pieces, I used it 1 or 2 times at the beginning, but I haven't really experimented with it too much, to be honest. So I can't really comment too much on that.
Yeah, I was going to say, when you mentioned like setting up other tactics, I guess you're going into team management in the ultimate team squad screen, maybe duplicating your tactic in that screen. So you have, a couple of options. If you're playing counter build-up or something, then you might switch it to balanced, that sort of thing. And then when you're in game, it's press left, isn't it? And it will show you your preset tactics, the ones that you've created.
Yeah, so what you do is, let's say, for example, you have one formation. A lot of people just only have one formation, that's fine. So you go into your tactics and maybe you'll duplicate that 2 times. So you'll have 3 different variations. So maybe, for example, on your defensive one, you may reduce your depth to, for example, like 31, 35, for example. Then maybe on the balanced one, the middle one, maybe you might have your depth on, for example, like 50. And maybe for your attacking one, you got your depth a bit higher. So you can change your focuses. And even, for example, your instructions, so your center mids, you can change them from holding in the defensive ones. And then the attacking variations of that formation, you can put them on playmaker. So the idea is when you're inside the game, let's say you go a goal up and maybe you find your opponent is overcommitting more players. Maybe they've changed formation to become more attacking. You can just change to a defensive shape using the same formation per se, but just a different system. So as you said, maybe you might not use, for example, I like to use counter a lot of the time. Maybe you want to put that to balanced. Maybe you want players to come close with short passing. So that would just depend on what you want, but I would say always try to make a defensive, a balanced, and attacking tactic at the very least minimum, and don't use the tactical suggestions.
Yeah. Is that something you've done, DJ, so far? Like, had another tactic up your sleeve, and have you found that's helped in some situations?
They're there and loaded, but because of the sort of roll pluses and roll pluses, I'm never confident enough to use them at the right time, I don't think. So I need to get more variations that align to the players I have and the players I have on the bench.
And Josh, I know you have been playing recently with left wing and right wing. Have you set up a tactic with maybe a left mid and right mid instead? Because I really find that if I'm playing left wing and right wing, my opponent's sending a lot of players forward, I do get kind of overloaded towards the end of games if I'm winning and they're chasing.
Yeah, I haven't done yet. I've kind of just committed to using my tactic. I may go in and change a couple of roles. And it's one of those things where I should go and set up a couple of tactics that are in my list of 5 tactics on the left D-pad menu, but I've not settled on one tactic for long enough to have those variations set in there yet. And I kind of think, reflecting DJ as well, especially with the roll pluses and how roll pluses and how that works, and the kind of lack of tactical flexibility in terms of position wise, that would take a long time, I think, to go through it. When you're swapping players and wanting to use different teams and different players, you've got different roles. Actually, you probably should just finesse your first tactic to be as good as it can be. And then maybe afterwards, you can start having things that you switch into in positions where you need to score a goal or where you need to defend. Maybe having a tactic you switch into to counter a 5 at the back, or the 4-2 that has everybody on holding and defend. That could be something that I look into, especially sooner rather than later. I have seen that there are some issues, though, with changing tactics on the D-pad. Sometimes it just doesn't register. And we've also got that weird thing this year where substitutions have to wait for another time that the ball goes out of play, and there's a loading period of your team changing tactics that's helped when the ball goes out of play, but it's not super consistent whether you'll change. So yeah, it's not something I've necessarily put together myself. I'm still trying to do it in the menus, which with the number of options we've got and the time limit, is usually a bit of a scramble. But
yeah, I do feel not very advised. I have to say, when I was playing the 4-3-3, kind of going between tactics at the moment, but I did find it very helpful to have a tactic set up which was a 4-1-4-1 and had the right mid and left mid on winger, because that means they actually defend a bit more. And if they're pushing their fullbacks forward, as people sometimes do, as they're chasing a game, even if they're bringing them forward somewhat manually, it was really helpful for just making sure that I had players to mark and I wasn't getting overloaded in wide areas. So that is potentially something to look at if you are playing a formation where you end up with a lot of players up the field and not coming back to help defensively. I don't know whether you, Neal, have any further thoughts on this particular element before we move on.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, just to add, is that with tactics this year, the most frustrating thing is finding players in the right position. So one of my favorite formations currently is the 4-2-2, but there's only a finite number of cams that have pace and are good enough to shoot. If you go on foot.gg and you go on the second page after that, most of them you're not really going to be using let's say you exclude the top tier icons that no one can really afford. So what I would suggest is, instead of going and changing your entire team when you try a tactic, create a cheap team and use that team. So don't go and change your entire team when you want to try a tactic out. What I think we're going to be forced to use this year is, like, let's say you have, for example, a 4-2-2-2. Maybe you could use a 4-2-3-1 as a different variation, as long as you can find a player like that can play the striker or the camera. I think Zola is an example of that. So if you have a similar formation that has similar roles, I would say try to find that. And even if you can't get a role plus, it's not the end of the world. As long as they're in the correct position, that's the most important thing. As long as they're not out of position, you're fine. Another quick tip is try to get a super sub. Like Llorente, he can play centre mid, he can play right back, he can play right wing, I think, as well. So if I need to ever convert into a back five or anything like that, I have someone like Koundé and Llorente, very versatile players, can play on the right back, on the right-hand side, but also can play that centre-back role for Koundé's sake, or Llorente can play centre mid or right back.
Yeah, and then actually let's move us on to the final element, I guess, of D-pad tactics, which is tactical focus. You get to that by pressing right on the D-pad. And I think this is maybe a little more useful for a quick change. Default is just what you have set up as standard. But then if you go to defending or attacking, it will basically change your role focuses to be more attacking or more defensive. And it'll adjust your build-up and defensive approach. Increase it slightly if you go to attacking to be maybe counter and aggressive. Or if you were to go more defensive, I guess it would drop it down. And obviously, sometimes that's not going to do anything if you're either end of the spectrum. But I think it can be useful if you want like a quick change. But again, Neal, I guess you should really just set it up yourself and just manually then switch to it by pressing left and switching to one of your other tactics, right?
Yeah, I would say, to be honest, it's better just because you could technically, if you've chosen the right formation, you can have up to 4 or 5 different variations if you include the balance variation. But one way this can be used, actually very nifty trick, is like, let's say you have different formations set up, like you might have like a 4-2-2-2, a 4-2-1-3, and let's say like a 4-4-2. Let's just assume here, hypothetically, all the roles are perfect. And what you could do is you could make a formation more defensive or more attacking on the fly. So let's say, for example, you change, for example, to a 4-4-2. And let's say it's actually working quite well. Maybe your opponent's using a 4-1-2-1-2 narrow and you're exposing the wider areas, but you want that formation to be just slightly more attacking. Maybe you could, for example, change your tactical focus to attacking. Equally, for example, let's say if you're up against your opponent and maybe, for example, they have a 4-4-2, you could change to your 4-4-2, but maybe your 4-4-2 is slightly too attacking. Maybe you got your inside forwards on attacking on the left mid and right mid. But if you change your tactical focus to defend, you can stay in that same system, but just make it more defensive. So that would be my best advice. So when you choose a formation, you don't have to use a tactical focus, but you can help make the formation more defensive or more attacking. It can help you if you don't have any pauses left. This additional feature, but I'll be honest, as I mentioned in the beginning, just try to create 5 tactics in the beginning, a defensive, a balanced, or attacking at the bare minimum, and use that. And then once you get to that advanced level, you can start tinkering with the tactical focuses.
Yeah, that makes sense. And actually, the final thing that I completely forgot to mention so far is substitutions, which are available by pressing down. And some of them are decent suggestions sometimes. So it might just be worth checking there before you use up a pause, just to see if it's a substitution that will actually help you. Right, let us take a break on that, and we'll come back in just a second to talk about DJ's gameplay, give him some advice, and any listeners out there as well. Let's get back into it after this break. Hello, welcome back after the break. Right, let's get into the DJ gameplay segment. And DJ, first of all, actually, it'd be good to kind of set the scene a little bit for listeners. So last week we did this with 𝗵𝘀𝗻, who hadn't yet qualified for champs. And I can reveal, of course, completely down to our advice, he did qualify for champs. And we'll have him back on on next week's supporter gameplay episode to talk a little bit more about how it has been for him and maybe some further steps he can take. But here we'll be focused on DJ's gameplay. So DJ, where are you in terms of your, I guess, gameplay ability this cycle, and what was it like last cycle as well?
So last cycle I was getting 11 wins generally in champs, occasionally 14, got to the elite division and was doing it okay, but yeah, I felt I sort of cracked it, had more of an idea of what I was doing by the end of the cycle. This year I don't feel like I've really got the hang of what I'm trying to do all the time. So it's sort of throwing a lot of stuff at the game at the moment to try and work out what my play style is going to be like, how I'm going to play the game, trying lots of different things. I've managed to get myself into champs each week. And I'm generally, I think I was a 7-8 first week, then 8-7, then 9-6. And then this weekend I was 8-7 again. But the game I've sent you guys to tear me apart from, I just felt like it was one of those weekends where I couldn't get anything going. Just nothing seemed to flow. So I thought it would be absolutely fascinating to find out whether you guys can uncover why sometimes I feel like I've really cracked it, and sometimes I just feel a little clueless on the game, and I certainly did this weekend.
And actually, just as a more generic point, Neal, you obviously coach a lot of people, interact a lot with players who are this kind of level, and maybe even slightly worse, looking to improve. Do you feel like 𝗵𝘃25 has been tough for people in terms of like adjusting and getting to grips or feeling comfortable with the game?
So first of all, I would say everyone across all levels are struggling. It's not just the lower tiers, but I would say it's those that don't have the fundamentals in check are the ones that are struggling the most. I'll talk about this more when I go over into the gameplay, but what I feel like this year, the game is very slow and you have to be very patient. The two biggest killers would be a lack of basics and fundamentals and frustrations. And I think especially as you play the game more and more, and with now no relegation in, it's going to indirectly incite a lot of frustration. So I would say the key things you really need to focus on is A, is mentality. Don't be frustrated. And B, you have to look at your gameplay back, as we're going to do in a second, but also make sure your basics are in order. It's probably the most important thing. And I think the people that are struggling the most are people that maybe they have the basics, or maybe they forgot about it, or they're doing it sometimes, but they're not doing it consistently. And that's what's costing them.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And Josh, what about you? I mean, obviously, you are capable of getting, at least last cycle, consistent enough 14-win champs. Your kind of level as well, do you feel like there has been a fair bit of adjustment to this game's nuances, should we say?
Yeah, it's definitely been a different game. I think it's more in my wheelhouse of how I like to play the game, in terms of like, I've never been a extremely techie left stick dribbler, and you can't do that this year. And as much as there is absolutely some issues with passing, as someone who played on full manual controls for a number of years, like, actually, I find passing to not be as bad as everyone else's, just because I've never relied too heavily on the kind of, the guardrails that have been provided in previous years. And so being able to kind of maneuver a ball around a pitch and utilize runners is definitely been something that I've enjoyed more. But I think this game can be far more frustrating than previous titles. I think mainly because of how difficult it has been to break people down defensively, and especially in tight games being decided by kind of lucky bounces of a ball. And the tackle backs this year are really, really quite strong, especially like you can win the ball, get a touch with a defender, and if that touch isn't absolutely perfect, you're probably going to lose the ball instantly. So yeah, it's taken some time to get used to, but in terms of like core fundamentals of the game, this one more suits my preferred style of playing. I sympathize, but it's not been quite as like tough. I've found I've not experienced the same difficulties as others have.
Yeah, I think you're kind of quite neatly reflecting Neal's point there in a way, I guess, because as you say, more solid on the fundamentals, and so the way the game works this cycle, it's maybe been less of a shock going into a game where those fundamentals do feel extra important. I mean, as they often are at the start of a cycle, actually, to be fair. Right, let's get into taking a look at the gameplay. Now, we will link to the raw gameplay footage in the description of this podcast. I'll pop it in the Discord as well. So that will help people who maybe want a bit of a visual aid. But we're not going to be going through, frame by frame, and you'll be able to follow this by just listening.
If you look there.
Yeah.
We won't be doing
I think raw is probably a good preparation for people as well. It's pretty raw stuff.
But yeah, if you want the raw experience, then you can watch the full clip. But obviously, it will be fine to just listen along, and the advice we give is hopefully advice that people can pick up on, whether they are going to watch it or not. That's the idea here. And I think we'll start actually with the defensive side. When we're talking about Brammer's gameplay on the supporter gameplay episode last week, a big thing was too much controlling of the defensive midfielder and not looking to switch to a defender to handle basically developing threats and issues with the defensive shape, and it was then very easy for the opponent to pull that apart. I would say this is actually quite different. DJ's gameplay. DJ is moving around between players, controlling different players. Potentially, Josh, you were saying to me, you think there might be a bit too much of that, actually.
It's not necessarily that there's too much movement of players. I do think that DJ has a tendency to overcommit at times, especially with the tackle. It's not even just like running a player to cover, a sprint down the wing, for example, but like late lunges when the ball's kind of not there to be won, very often puts a defender out of position for him and can cause them for the rest of the defense to be a bit scrambly and trying to get back and cover off. I think the biggest thing for me was you're very good at not utilizing second man press high up the pitch in positions where actually if you did second man press, it would probably make it easier for an opponent to kind of play out. But there are positions defensively where it's clear that an opponent wants to pass the ball infield, for example, where the way that you're defending with a fullback is the same that second man press would do, in that they would go and put pressure on the ball, but they're not like actively like torpedoing in to try and win the ball immediately. And cutting off the passing lane is the more important thing to be doing in that situation. Quite a lot of times, especially when the opponent was tacking down their right, you would control the outside fullback and kind of leave the pass inside. For me, I think it's very important to think about where you want your opponent to have the ball if they're going to have it. Showing an opponent down the line to a fullback by utilizing a midfielder is going to be much more advantageous for you in terms of then isolating an attacker, trying to win the ball back off them, because one-on-one, actually, you're quite good at kind of shepherding people out of play. It was in more open play where you'd be kind of lunging from quite a long distance away, and it would like freeze players and allow then a runner to get beyond and give them a shooting chance. I suppose like my question for you in terms of defensively is, are you somebody that has always lent on like the tackle button more often than not? Because it does feel like it's something you use quite a lot.
I would say it's a bit of the opposite. I very much was one of those ones that just let players run into my guy to win the ball last year. But because it's just not as successful this year, I've been trying to physically tackle more, but I do think it's a little bit of spamming the tackle button at the moment because I'm not completely sure when it's going to be most effective, as I haven't used it all that much successfully in the past.
Yeah, and I think there were situations where you set things really nicely to actually second man press when your opponent's out wide, and actually you instead just control the player, as Josh was mentioning, who's closest to the ball, and miss out on the opportunity to use a player on the inside to cut out the passing lane. So I think one thing to think about is when to use the second man press, which I think generally is when your opponent is out wide and when they are potentially looking to put the ball back into the center of the pitch, because there are opportunities where, they generated chances from gaps in the center of the pitch, which you could have filled with one of your maybe defensive midfielders, centre backs, if you'd second man pressed and just switched across to them. So I think that's quite a kind of not straightforward, because obviously, it takes a bit of multitasking almost to do that. But I think, you would have been able to do that, but just didn't end up switching. And actually over to you, Neal, from a defensive perspective, was there anything particularly you wanted to pick out?
So, DJ, in terms of your gameplay, one thing I would first of all say is maybe change to the co-op camera angle. It allows you to see more information on the pitch. And also, when you're defending, I feel like sometimes you're putting yourself in a bit of a panic. At least with a co-op camera angle, it's zoomed out. So when the ball is in the middle of the pitch, you can see where your defensive line is. That would be the first suggestion I will give you. Number two, it would be when you're defending, you said last year that you didn't tackle as much. That's exactly what you should be doing. You should not be tackling as much. This year, you're over tackling. What you need to do is you have to always remember positioning is the most important thing. I could put, for example, 𝗬�ឍ, who's 5'9". I could put her in centre back, out of position. I can control her myself. If the player runs into me, I'm going to get the ball, even though she's got 20 stand tackling or something. So at the end of the day, positioning is the most important thing. And that's what you need to focus on the most. So in my opinion, keep your defensive line in shape. If you're unsure, you can always bring your CDM back to help you defend. I see you using a formation with CDMs, and this is for everyone else in the podcast as well. If you're really struggling, use a formation with CDMs because they sit deeper, especially with a holding role. In your gameplay, and this is a very, very common thing, especially when you conceded the first goal, you can see it was almost out of nothing. You basically created a situation for your opponent. But this is what's common. And these are the small things. In fact, I know we're going to go over your attack in a second, but generally your attack is pretty good. But remember, defending, look, attacking can win you games, but defense really wins you championships. And if you really want to improve, especially this year, because left stick is not really a big thing, I think it's actually even better for you to be a bit more passive. Don't use teammate contain with your defensive line or take a key integral part of your defense and push them out of position. Because effectively, you're creating that hole in that defensive line. So think of it like a wall. You're creating that hole for your opponent. Maybe on the wing areas, you can use teammate contain. So let's say you're playing like a 4-4-2 and the ball is on a wider area. Maybe you can use your right mid to apply teammate contain pressure, or maybe on a extreme situation like down the wing, if you're doing a cutback, then I understand, for example, using teammate contain with your fullback and maybe covering the middle person with your center back or your CDM. That's fine. But let's say, for example, you have a backline of 4 and you have one player running towards you. You do not want to be using teammate contain there, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Don't create a gap for your opponent. I just want to reiterate that. So I'm not saying you shouldn't use teammate contain, but I'm saying make sure you learn how to walk before you start running.
Yeah, I was interested to pick up actually on what you're saying, Neal, about co-op. DJ, have you tried co-op particularly? Because I myself took a while to switch over to co-op because I like telebroadcast for dribbling, and what's clear in your gameplay is you do a lot of dribbling and you're pretty successful in a lot of situations with your dribbling. Is that why you tend to use telebroadcast, just because it's a bit more kind of zoomed in, you can see the game a bit better?
I think two things this year. One, I think I've got used to being a bit closer, so I haven't gone back to it and haven't really thought about it. But you're absolutely right. I don't have the visibility of the pitch anymore. And the other reason is I've got a PS Portal now, and I've got to get a little bit closer for my old eyes so I can see what's going on.
Yeah, that makes sense. So the thing I was actually going to add to this is, have you considered using penalty box zoom? Because it's an option in the camera settings, and it will basically mean you zoom in once you get to either your penalty area or your opponent's penalty area. And for me, it allowed me to switch across to co-op from telebroadcast because I could then zoom in and do the intricate stuff around the box without losing out on the bigger picture. So potentially something to consider if you've not tried it already. And I would encourage listeners to play about with that as well if you haven't done so, because it can be very good. Nice. Anything, Josh, you wanted to add on the dribbling side of things?
I think in your general gameplay, patience is something that I think would really help you on both sides of the ball, both defensively, patiently waiting for an opportunity to win the ball back rather than kind of actively pressing. But in attack, the number of times, especially with Rashford, that you would kind of dribble straight into a defender because there's not really too many options. And this is part of my issue with playing the kind of 4-2 with 2 DMs. But this is part of my issue playing the kind of 4-2 formations with 2 DMs on holding, is that there's not really the option to kind of cut back into the midfield as much. There was quite a few situations where you would get the ball into a good position and not let the play develop, not just stand on the ball and kind of let the play kind of move in front of you to then pick something out. There was kind of a couple of like panicked through balls to a striker that was offside or to a player that kind of just wasn't there to receive a pass. But I was conscious of this last week, and Bramos was lovely about it, but we didn't really talk about what he did well. You are very, very good at dribbling the ball. Like your on-ball movement, especially with Hazard and the R1. There was a run that you did where you played him down the right wing, you cut inside, you beat a defender, came back to the edge of the box, beat the entire defensive line. Now, you didn't shoot when you had like a completely open near post to shoot into, but the dribbling was absolutely like fantastic and is clearly a very strong part of your game. To the point that there are times that you are over dribbling when you should be passing the ball, and there seems to be a bit of a pattern with your play of getting the ball into the attackers a pass too early, skipping the midfielder, like as I wrote in capital letters, utilize 𝘵𝘃𝗍𝘀. There was kind of like 3.5 bars on a pinged pass into Rashford, who then kind of doesn't really have a lot going on around him because Hazard's probably already made his run and James is kind of like just in a position that it's difficult to pass back to. But in terms of like the dribbling in and of itself, it's definitely, in my opinion, the strongest part of your game. It's just more about, kind of like with the second man press, when to utilize that dribbling, like and how you're going to do it for how long, like learning when you've beaten a man and can just accelerate away. Because there's a few times where you'd beat a player and then continue with like a techie dribble, but you could have just accelerated into the space you'd created to kind of like hammer home the advantage of getting somebody to commit with a defender.
Yeah, the amount of times that you did something really good to beat a player, or maybe even beat a few players, but actually didn't capitalize on the good work that you've done, almost kind of like you sort of panicked a little bit. It was like a constant feature of the gameplay. And I think knowing when to sprint after you've beaten someone is really important. But also it can be as simple as thinking, okay, the space is opened up, here's the space. Immediately sprint into that space. It doesn't matter what direction that space is in. Don't think too much about that. Just take the space, and your opponent is then left scrambling and will try to, move their defenders to compensate for the fact that you've burst into a space that they probably don't want you to be in. And that's when you need to slow it maybe down a little bit to look for, runners coming towards you. Because as Josh mentioned just then, there were quite a lot of situations where you didn't really have any support and you didn't wait on the ball or hold the space that you had. You just dribbled into your opponent's centre backs or into some players when actually, had you waited a bit, you'd have quite a promising attacking opportunity. And I know the feeling is, I'm up against the back line, I should attack the back line, but actually you're still outnumbered. Like, it's Rashford against 4 defenders, so you need to wait for the other players to get up, and you should still probably have an advantage when you're in that situation. I don't know whether there are any kind of specifics about dribbling, Neal, that you'd picked up on or kind of creating chances here.
What I just wanted to say is one thing, maybe you're getting away with it with the players that you're playing now, but when you're spamming these skill moves inside the final third, you should be using it inside the box or inside a final third to give you the space. But what a lot of the time you're doing is in midfield is you're losing the ball. But not only when you lose the ball, you have to think of it from how it affects you from a defensive end, because then you're not in shape. You're either a player committing forward, or maybe you're not quick to react. So one thing I would say is that when you're building up, I agree, take it slow, take that touch away when you get the ball. If you got to make that touch away and keep it safe, or you got to pass the ball away so you don't get tackled from behind, then do it. But when you get the ball, let's say around the center circle, you should not be trying to do, for example, a skill move there. In fact, your attack is pretty good. You know a lot of things. You have a lot of things in your arsenal, if anything. You know how to do the power shot, etc., etc. But get inside the box and then use those skill moves. So you work more on the basics, on doing a 1-2, waiting for that player to overlap on the wing, for example, then doing a lob through ball or through ball in behind. And then when you get the ball, for example, near the penalty arc or inside the box, then you can use a skill move to give yourself the gap. But don't just use the skill move, for example, near the center circle, where you basically, sometimes you get through, sometimes you don't. But when you verse a better player, that's when you'll really get caught out. So if you can't go through, you have to rotate the ball around. A common thing people always realize is thinking, look, I can get the ball from my goalkeeper and I can run to the other end and I can create a chance. But when you get to the elite level, a lot of the game is just rotating the ball around, recycling the ball, almost waiting for your opponent to make a mistake or waiting for that gap. So that is something that's probably aiding your frustration even more compared to last year, because maybe what you could have got away with, you can't get away with anymore. So in my opinion, less of the skill moves in the middle of the pitch, more in the final third, and just focus on the 1-2s. The 1-2s, wait for the player to make a run, then make the through ball. I would say that would help you and just slow your gameplay down. I feel like maybe, especially when your opponent, got the goal back, it's almost like you're trying to rush, trying to get back into it. You got to play this game slow. The biggest thing that can kill you this year is frustration and rushing your gameplay. I can tell you this for a fact. A lot of people, for example, they only have like 10 games left in a weekend league and they're thinking, I've only got time to play 5. They try to play all 10 in that same amount of time and probably will get even less wins. So at the end of the day, you have to keep it calm, don't rush. And in my opinion, don't use the skill moves outside the final third. Only use it really when you're trying to create that chance or create that angle to take a shot, as opposed to trying to beat a player midfield. In my opinion, just rotate it back.
I know you love Hazard and he does a lot of good things for you.
So what pack luck, by the way?
Yeah, first pack of 𝘵ci𝗰𝗶𝗹, and I get the 90 in November, so it's not like he's not going to be in the team.
Yeah.
There are situations where he isn't the best player to help you score the goal in that situation. There was especially a point in extra time when you've gone 3-2 down. You beat a player on the wing, cut inside with him perfectly. 𝗪𝗍 making the easiest swerve pass or just normal through ball or even chipped ball into the box, and it would have been a 80% chance of a goal. And you kind of hold the ball to try and dribble through the entire defense with Hazard. So it's one of those things of almost as if you were playing as the player. Pick your head up, look for the pass when you're on the ball in certain situations. Momentum's such a massive thing this year with player runs that if you can play the pass at the right time, you can play a player into open space even if they're not in open space when you play the pass. It's a kind of touch and a feel thing, but there are definitely scenarios where, kind of as Neal was saying, even the 1-2s, the ball will travel faster than you will, actually controlling it. If you pass the ball, you can start moving players into spaces where they can cause more of an issue. With Hazard, very often you dribble past the midfielder, whereas if you played a 1-2 with 𝗬𝘃, who was in open space, you could have just played it around the midfielder and only had to beat the final defender to get your shot off with Hazard.
I think sometimes I've pre-decided what I'm going to do and I then just get a bit pitch blind. I'm not looking at anything else.
That's exactly what I said to Josh when I was looking at your gameplay. I was like, it reminds me of me because I also do that. And this is what I'm going to do, and deciding that ahead of time and then not really reacting to what the opponent has done. And I think that thinking, okay, and having a look actually at what my opponent is doing, how they're moving their defense is something that I think helps a lot. And as soon as I'm doing that, suddenly I'm just finding a route to goal, which was just actually so much easier than I was making it seem.
I sometimes see it after as well. I'll do something stupid and then go, look at him, he's all by himself. Why didn't I hit that pass?
Yeah.
Maybe it's worth taking Hazard off for a weekend league. I know you're going to kill me, right? But I think statistically...
Oh no, you've been planted. This is a plant.
you would probably get more wins, I would say. One thing I wanted to say is, look, also, watch your gameplay back. I'm going to be honest, but it's important I be candid here. Your opponent wasn't that good, but they had actually a lot more chances and they should have scored more goals. When you verse a better player, they're really going to capitalize on those chances. One thing I'd recommend is put your controller on the top right. So if you go into settings, or the users at home, you can go into settings, the listener, should I say, sorry, go into visual and turn on your controller settings, the input. I forgot what the exact name is, but the controller input.
Yeah.
That way, when you watch your gameplay back, you can see what you're doing. Because sometimes you might think, oh, what was I pressing it? Oh, did I mean to do that? But when you're watching a gameplay back, for example, we're using the running jockey or the jockey. Sometimes you won't know. So have the controller there. That way you know what buttons you're pressing is what I wanted to say. And then the second thing is, when you watch your gameplay back, sometimes there's 2 ways you can help change. This is the way that I recommend teaching yourself, right? If you're going to concede, watch back 45 seconds and talk about look at how you've lost the ball and always think, what did I do wrong and what could I change? And when you're attacking, when you watch your gameplay back, I know it does take some effort, but sometimes just pause the video and ask yourself, if I can look back in time, what would I do differently here? Think about what you would do, then press play and see what you would do. You'll actually find that patterns in play that you realize that you're not doing, but subconsciously doing, will affect you. Those are 2 top tips I would say. So put your controller on, and when you watch your gameplay back, analyze it. Sometimes a lot of people, I can tell from experience, they think they're doing the right thing, but when you're in the heat of the moment, you're not doing the right thing. Even myself, sometimes I say, oh, I did the right thing, but when I watch it back, I actually didn't do the right thing. So always check your gameplay back is what I'd recommend.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Is there anything, DJ, you wanted to ask Neal? Because I know Neal's got to head off shortly. So if there's anything that you wanted to mention,
be cruel to be kind. Obviously, I'm just sort of trying to tally the tears up at the moment, but I'll be all right. I'm not dropping Hazard, but beyond that. I do. How can I get my head up a bit more to spot the opportunities? What's the best way? Again, as you say, keep watching the videos to do it again. But in the moment, are there ways to sort of slow it down? Are there any tips and tricks just to what you can do, and almost not to press a button, or to hold that space and look as opposed to commit quickly?
There's 2 things that I say in coaching. Number 1 is you ban yourself from using the run button. Now, I know you like to use your ball rolls, the scoops, etc., but banning yourself from using the run button, because just by holding the ball, sometimes if you have, let's imagine this, you have the ball with your cam outside the box and your opponent's CDM is man marking your striker. If you just rotate the ball around or hold the ball a little bit more, maybe your opponent will move. But you can also see what your opponent is doing. And this will help you in your decision making. So just not running with the ball a lot of the time can really, really help you. It sounds so insignificant, but trust me, not running with the ball, A, you won't lose the ball as much, but B, will give you more thinking time. And don't forget, when you're running, you can't do skill moves. If you want to make a pass at that exact time, you can make that pass. When you're running, you can't do that. You have to wait for the player to touch the ball again. You can do L1 triggers all the time and release the ball when you want to. So that's the first tip. The reason why I suggested co-op as well is, even though you may not see the players, subconsciously you know the player is there. So let's say, for example, you're defending and you see your opponent's left mid, for example, you're going to know that maybe your opponent's left back is committed forward. You can see that. So when you're counter-attacking, even though you're not thinking about it, you subconsciously know, oh, my opponent's left back committed forward at that point. I can then drive into that space. So it's not only for just knowledge, it's also for the information that you get subconsciously. Yep. I know what you're saying with the patient report. What I'd recommend is, look, go with co-op, zoom in all the way. That way it's the closest to telebroadcast, but it's still zoomed out. So go co-op 20 height for the best perception above.
Yep.
Between the players, 20 zoom. And that way you have the closest thing as what I'd recommend. So those are probably the top 2 tips. And don't forget, even the top tier players, even pro players use co-op. The difference is on that level, it's a bit different. They look at the radar. The way to know if you're really a good player is you can actually play the game by just looking at the radar. If you can do that, then you don't need to use the co-op camera angle. That's the way I would recommend it. So that's how people get away with it. And sometimes just having that bit of awareness subconsciously can really make a big difference. But really just slow it down. Really just don't run with the ball as well, I'd say.
Nice.
Great tips. And thank you very much, Neal, for coming along to give some advice on this podcast. And of course, people can catch Neal's YouTube guides. I mean, loads of content. You got the website as well. People should check that out. How do they find it, Neal? Just search NealGuides?
Yep, just search NealGuides or nealguides.com or neal.gg. Any of those links that will take you straight through to all my socials.
Before he goes, I just want to shout out, Neal tweeted something that I definitely think we should revisit in a future gameplay podcast about older players spacing their games out over multiple days, especially in champs, because your ability to concentrate over long periods of times decreases, especially in a game as high-paced that requires your focus as much as FC does. And I definitely think it's something that maybe us old fogies on the podcast should try out.
Yeah, I totally agree. And great stuff. Thank you very much, Neal, for coming on. It's been great.
Thank you very much.
Neal's going, but we'll be back just to chat about a few other bits to wrap up the podcast just after this break. Hello, listeners and supporters. A quick reminder that the 36,000 FC point giveaway for supporters has about a week or so left to run. So if you are a supporter, do get entered. And if you're not yet a supporter, then it's a great time to become one. You do get a bonus episode every single week on the first tier, which is just £3 a month. And on the other tiers, there is access to the Discord, which has fantastic resources, a great community, and of course, that rush matchmaking system. So if you fancy supporting the pod and getting loads in return, then do head over to Patreon. Just search Support for Weekly or follow the link link in the description of this podcast to sign up. Thank you very much if you do consider supporting, or if you are doing so already. It is greatly appreciated. And for now, let's jump back into this week's episode. Hello, welcome back to what will be a very short little end segment, but we did want to share some important tactical, I guess, warnings, Josh, about the way DJ had set up. DJ actually did say in that break that he changed his tactics, and I think sensibly so, because, well, you could explain, but there was quite a big gap in the defensive setup.
Yeah, and I'd be interested to know from DJ, because it felt like, looking at your tactical setup, and just for those that won't be able to see the video, it was a 4-2-1-3. So the 4 defenders, 2 DMs, the cam, and then a classic front 3 with the 2 wingers and a striker. And it was set up with the 2 DMs on holding, which is fairly common. That is usually paired with fullbacks on balanced. People going for that kind of 6-0-4 type setup. You have Kyle Walker at right back and had him on a false back defend. And that is his only role plus.
Yep.
But I wondered if that was a tactical decision or he's got role plus there, I'm going to put that on.
A little bit from column A, a little bit from column B. I saw the plus, gave it a go.
My reasoning behind picking it up is that if you switch to the with ball view of the tactic you were using, you'll see that you have 2 centre backs, a maelstrom of 3 defensive midfielders who won't get forward in front of them, and then a big long gap, and then a cam and the 3 strikers, and then the left back's kind of just out doing his own thing on this side. And what it meant is that if I was playing against you and I noticed that Kyle Walker was cutting inside, I just have my left winger on winger attack, and they would just stay forward and there'd be a consistent out ball for me the entire time. But the other thing that happened with you playing like that was when you lost possession in your opponent's third, you had no pressure on the ball at all because the DMs were too deep, and it gave your opposition way too much time to break out of defense, when actually being able to press high this year against a player that you were much better than your opponent in this game, you would have really hurt them trying to play out, because if there's so many times where they would have the ball maybe 10 yards in front of their own box, but in 30 yards of space to run into because of that tactical setup. So not only did I feel like 2 holding and the false back kind of messed up your midfield shape on the ball, but it also meant that neither of the DMs really got forward and put any real pressure on midfield, which meant that you're then having to grab them to run forward to put pressure on. Now their momentum's all running up the field rather than kind of shadowing a player back. And so if you don't make the tackle, then they're now out of position and too far up the pitch. It's why your game feels a bit more like a basketball game than a football game, because there was just a vacated space in the middle of the pitch.
And actually, one thing I would add on this that's interesting is you said to me, actually, DJ, when you sent the clip, that it was a messy game. And I think this is exactly why it was a messy game. It was actually more of a tactical thing, as much as your own sort of, I don't know, feeling like you were doing things which weren't great. It was actually that it was making it very easy for your opponent to just get down the other end of the pitch. And to be fair, you were working it back up the other end of the pitch pretty quickly as well. But I think that was more because you were actually the superior player in this game, even though it ended up going to penalties. But you made it very easy for them to attack you because of that lack of pressure. And it made it very difficult for you to recycle the ball as well, because your midfielders were so deep. You had 𝘬𝘲𝘃 at cam on roaming, and he wasn't really providing a pivot option either. And so I'd just say to listeners, do look at your with ball shape. And when you're actually in a game, just look and see whether you're actually able to apply pressure to your opponent as they move it out of defense. And I think simply, Josh, all you need to do is make sure in that situation that you have the fullback probably as a regular fullback, and also maybe one of the defensive midfielders on maybe deep lying playmaker roaming is quite a good one, right? To make sure that they're actually getting involved in the build-up.
Yeah, I think deep liar playmaker roaming would have definitely helped. And also potentially even with 𝘬𝘲𝘃, not having him on roaming would stop him drift. It felt very often like he drifted far too wide for you to really offer an option inside, and just having him on balanced would have allowed him to just be an option for you to cut back to without him making the run too far wide for it to be something you're not really interested in passing. But yeah, I'd suggest that if you're going to go with the two DMs, have at least one of them that gets forward a bit, and then just have the right back behind on balanced, have them on full back balanced, or even full back defend, so that they're just back there as cover for you to allow that defensive midfielder to get forward, so that then you're attacking with more of a 5, and you can start. It'll be then much easier for you to start playing those 1-2s that we were talking about. So yeah, it felt like one of those tactical setups where going for the roll pluses, I think, hurts you more than it does just having a tactic that kind of makes sense.
Interestingly, the formation I've switched to is 4-1-4-1. So I've got 2 CMs and 1 CDM now. And you feel like you get a lot more of that.
Yeah.
There's a lot more happening in the middle of the field. There's a lot more people who can put pressure and create pressure.
Yeah.
So it's made a big difference, I think, this morning, giving that a go versus how I struggled through the weekend.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think it's something that is an easy trap to fall into when playing these 2 CDM formations. And I think if you're listening to this and are playing a 2 CDM formation, just maybe take a check and see whether that's something that might be affecting you, because sometimes it can not matter too much because the way your opponent's playing, they don't really take advantage of it, but it can be kind of fatal in games, even against worse opponents. So I think it's quite important to take a look at that. So yeah, I think that is where we're going to wrap up, and hopefully, DJ, you can take something away from that, and let us know how it goes, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. I've taken away from it that I'm a fantastic dribbler and I should never drop Hazard. But on a serious point, thank you. Really appreciate it. All that sort of feedback's fantastic. There's lots of things to have a think about. So I'm going to definitely just try and take more of a breath and have a look at what I'm doing in attacking, and be a little bit more conscious around moving my defence around, as well as listen back to a number of other things and watch the video back a bit more.
Nice, great. Thank you very much, DJ, for joining us on the podcast.
Brilliant. Thanks for all the help.
It's been a pleasure. And Josh, thank you very much as well for all your analysis on this episode.
Yeah, it was a good one. It was interesting to see different gameplay types, and I think it's something that we'll eventually do for me and you as well, and we'll get critique to high heaven. We'll ask people to be very brutal, because it can feel quite personal when someone's looking at what you're doing and telling you where they think you can do better.
Yeah. I know what you mean. I appreciate both Brammers and DJ for offering their gameplay for us to analyze. As I said before, Brammers was on the last episode, a great success story, I guess, because he did eventually qualify for champs after that podcast. If you want to catch that, it's last week's supporter gameplay episode. So do go back and check that out if you're a supporter. If you're not a supporter, then you could consider supporting. Get that episode and an extra episode every single week. There is just about still time as well to enter the supporter giveaway, so you can do that. Just search Support for Weekly wherever you do your searching, and the Patreon will come up and you can sign up there. It's very quick and easy, and it is just £3 a month. So there we go. Thank you very much to all those supporters supporting, and to those icon patrons: Dave B, Hugh J, Jeff B, Darren W, Warren A, Stephen M, Waterman, Dan W, Roger D, Rob P, Lee A, Dom P, L M, Damon H, The Shirt Locker, Alex M, Tom B, Jake S, Neil P, Michael K, David G, Andrew R, Michael H, Jimmy K, Brendan T, Berta Saka, Michael B, Brian V, Josh R, Brent P, Rob W, and Juicy. Plus a special thanks to Luke M, Dave B, Hugh J, Tom M, Darren W, and Pato Foot for advice and production assistance. Before I leave you, just one more thing to add though. Ultimate Team is a bit like life really. It has its many ups and downs. If you're having a few more downs than ups in real life in these more difficult times, then please don't feel that you're alone or need to struggle on without taking action. If you go to thecalmzone.net, there's loads of resources, advice, support, or even just a friendly chat for anyone who needs it. If it sounds like it could help you, then head over to thecalmzone.net. And for now, have a good one, and I'll catch you on the next podcast.